The horse's heart was beating wrong. Dr. Hannah Cole heard it before she saw the needle mark. The roar of the Kentucky Derby crowd rolled over Churchill Downs like weather, 80,000 voices rising beneath the bright Louisville sun. Brass music blared from the grandstand. Cameras swept across the track. Women in wide-brimmed hats leaned over balconies with champagne glasses, and men in linen suits checked betting slips with hands that shook from excitement, greed, or both. 3 minutes to post. 3 minutes before the most-watched horse race in America. And the favorite was standing in front of Hannah with death flickering beneath his skin. St. Meridian should have been restless. Thoroughbreds often were before a race. They felt the electricity of the crowd, the handlers, the cameras, the pressure vibrating through leather and muscle. But this was not nerves. His pulse skipped beneath Hannah's fingers. Fast, too fast. Then a pause. Then a hard double beat that made the stallion's flank twitch. Hannah lowered the stethoscope from beneath his girth and looked into the horse's eye. St. Meridian was a dark bay colt with a white star on his forehead, and the kind of intelligent, alert gaze that made great racehorses feel less like athletes and more like kings forced into human games. His eye was too wide. His nostrils flared sharply. Foam gathered at the corner of his mouth. "No," Hannah whispered. The assistant trainer beside her stiffened. "What do you mean, no?" Hannah lifted St. Meridian's mane and found it. A tiny puncture mark, hidden high on the left side of the neck, masked beneath coat oil and grooming powder. Fresh, clean, deliberate. She turned toward the paddock steward. "Scratch him." The man blinked, as if she had spoken another language. "What?" "Scratch St. Meridian. Now." Around them, the paddock moved with frantic ceremony. Jockeys adjusted silks. Cameras rolled. A commentator's voice boomed overhead, calling St. Meridian. "The animal America has been waiting to see." Hannah took a sterile swab from her kit and pressed it gently to the injection site. The horse shuddered. The assistant trainer grabbed her wrist. "Doctor, do not make a scene." Hannah looked at his hand until he released her. "This horse has an abnormal rhythm and a fresh injection mark. He does not go onto that track." A sharp voice cut through the paddock. "You had better be very careful with that accusation." Mason Harrow stepped between two handlers, wearing a cream suit, a red rose on his lapel, and the poisonous smile of a man who had never been told no by anyone he could not buy. He owned St. Meridian. He owned half the cameras currently pointed toward the paddock. He owned enough racing journalists, veterinarians, stewards, and politicians to believe the Derby was not an event, but a stage built for him. His gaze moved over Hannah's body before reaching her face. The calculation was immediate, cruel, public. "You are Dr. Cole?" he asked. "Hannah Cole, State Veterinary Review Team. You are the one who failed inspection at Saratoga last year." "I did not fail. I refused to clear a lame horse. And now you want to ruin the Kentucky Derby because you need attention." A nearby camera shifted. Hannah felt it before she saw it. The broadcast crew had caught the confrontation. "Mr. Harrow," she said, keeping her voice level, "your horse is in distress. My horse is the healthiest animal in this paddock. Then you will welcome an immediate blood test." His smile disappeared. The crowd beyond the rail began chanting St. Meridian's name. 3 minutes became 2. Hannah stepped toward the steward again. "I am exercising veterinary authority to scratch this horse." Mason moved in front of her. "You are exercising jealousy." The assistant trainer looked away. So did the steward. Hannah had seen this before. Not at this scale, not with millions watching, but the shape was familiar. Wealth pressing down on science. Ego pressing down on an animal that could not speak. Mason raised his voice so the people nearby would hear. "Just because you could never ride one of these animals does not mean you get to destroy the sport for people who belong here." The insult landed exactly where he intended. A few people laughed, not loudly. "Enough." Hannah's face heated, but her hand remained steady on St. Meridian's neck. "I am not here to ride him," she said. "I am here to keep him alive." Mason looked toward 2 security guards. "Remove her." The first guard hesitated. "She is the vet on duty." She is interfering with a federally broadcast sporting event. Hannah tried to step back toward the horse. The second guard took her arm. Do not touch me, she said. You need to come with us, ma'am. I am not leaving this animal. Mason leaned close enough that only she could hear. Your father tried to stop a race too. The world narrowed. Hannah's breath caught. Mason smiled. Look what that got him. The guards pulled her away. St. Meridian tossed his head, hooves striking the paddock brick. Hannah twisted against the grip on her arms. Scratch him, she shouted. He cannot run. The cameras followed. In the grandstand, people turned. On the giant video board above the infield, Hannah saw herself being dragged backward in her white veterinary coat, her dark hair coming loose from its clip, her full body framed beneath the words, Kentucky Derby Live. Millions of people were watching her be humiliated. Mason Harrow lifted one hand to signal the jockey. St. Meridian was led toward the track. Then the white rail fence opened. A man stepped through. The outriders saw him and reined their horses so hard the crowd gasped. He walked onto the track in a black suit, as if the entire derby had been built around his arrival. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and composed with the kind of stillness that made violence feel optional rather than necessary. His black hair was swept back from a severe face, olive skin, hard jaw, light stubble. A faint scar near his mouth that deepened when he looked at Mason Harrow. Hannah knew him from photographs she had tried not to remember. Santino Bellaforte. The Bellaforte family had been tied to horse racing in Kentucky, New York, Florida, and Dubai for 3 generations. Their stables were beautiful. Their money was old-looking, even when it was not. Their legitimate businesses filled glossy magazines. Their illegal businesses were spoken about carefully, or not at all. Santino was the man people stopped joking around. The man whose name could empty a private room. The man Hannah's father had warned her never to stand near. Santino raised one hand. The starting gate crew froze. The horses stopped moving. The crowd became confused noise. Mason Harrow's face went white with fury. Santino looked at the guards holding Hannah. Release Dr. Cole. No shouting. No threat. Just a quiet order that moved through the men faster than fear of Mason. The guards let her go. Hannah stumbled, caught herself, and turned toward him. Santino did not look at her at first. He looked at St. Meridian. The horse shifted restlessly, head jerking against the lead. Then Santino's eyes moved to the injection site beneath the mane. His expression did not change, but something dark passed through it. He stepped closer to the rail, between the horse and the track. No animal runs, he said, without Dr. Cole's permission. The statement spread across the broadcast microphones. The crowd roared, not cheering, reacting. Mason stormed toward him. You cannot stop the Kentucky Derby. Santino finally looked at him. I already have. You have no authority here. Santino's gaze moved across the grandstand, the steward's box, the owner's balcony, the broadcast towers, and finally, the paddock. Men in expensive suits began checking phones. Several did not like what they saw. My family built half the private barns, financed 3 of the syndicates represented here, and owns the security contractor that your people just used to drag a licensed veterinarian off the track, Santino said. Would you like me to discuss authority with you while the cameras are still recording? Mason did not answer. Hannah walked back to St. Meridian. No one stopped her this time. The horse's pulse was worse. She looked at Santino. Get him off the track. Quiet barn. No crowd. No sedatives until I know what he was given. Santino removed his suit jacket. The motion revealed black and gray tattoos at his wrists and the backs of his hands before his cuffs fell back into place. He handed the jacket to one of his men without looking. Open barn 12, he said. Lock down the back lane. No press, no Harrow staff. Mason laughed harshly. That is my horse. Santino stepped so close that Mason stopped breathing. Not if you poisoned him. Hannah should have felt relief. Instead, fear moved through her in a colder line, because Santino Bellaforte had just saved her in front of the world. And men like him did not do anything for free. _ Barn 12 smelled of hay, liniment, wet leather, and expensive panic. Rain began 20 minutes after the race was stopped. Not a storm yet, but a hard Kentucky spring rain that hammered the roof and turned the bright day gray. Outside, the Derby grounds were under lockdown. Police vehicles blocked the service roads. Private security lined the stables. The crowd was trapped in the stands, while officials tried to decide whether to call the delay a medical review, a security incident, or a disaster. St. Meridian stood in the center aisle beneath warm lights, his coat trembling. Hannah drew blood, checked his gums, listened again to his heart, and started supportive treatment with what she had available. A younger vet from the state team assisted with shaky hands. Santino remained near the stall door. Silent, watching everything, Hannah tried not to notice him. It was impossible. He filled the space without moving. The stable workers avoided looking at him directly. His men stayed outside because Hannah had ordered the aisle clear, and, to her surprise, Santino had made them obey. Mason Harrow paced near the far door, accompanied by a lawyer and 2 racing officials. "This is theater," Mason snapped. "That horse has been cleared by 3 private veterinarians." Hannah did not look up. "Then they missed the injection site. Or you invented it." She placed the blood tube into a sealed evidence sleeve. "You are welcome to say that again after the lab confirms a prohibited stimulant." Mason's lawyer stepped forward. "You are making a defamatory assumption." "No," Hannah said. "I am making a medical decision." Santino's voice came from the stall door. "And I am making a security decision. No one from Harrow's team touches that sample." The lawyer turned. "Mr. Bellaforte, your involvement creates a conflict." Santino's expression remained blank. "Almost everything I touch becomes a conflict." The younger vet nearly dropped the syringe. Hannah shot Santino a look. He noticed. His mouth did not move, but his eyes sharpened with something dangerously close to amusement. Then St. Meridian staggered. Hannah dropped the evidence sleeve into the assistant's hands and moved fast. "Hold his head. Keep him calm." The horse's front legs trembled. Santino was closest. For half a second, everyone waited to see whether the Mafia boss would step away from a 1,000-pound animal in distress. He did not. "What do you need?" he asked. Hannah looked at him. "You know horses? I know enough not to pretend I know more than the veterinarian. Stand by his shoulder. Talk low. Do not pull his head up. If he goes down, get out of his way." Santino moved exactly where she pointed. His hand settled against St. Meridian's neck. The horse snorted, but Santino's voice dropped into something low and steady in Italian. Hannah did not understand the words, only the tone. Calm, controlled, almost gentle. It was the first thing about him that frightened her differently. St. Meridian steadied. Hannah administered the medication and monitored his heart. The rhythm slowly shifted away from danger. One wrong minute could have killed him. One more lap under racing pressure definitely would have. When the horse finally lowered his head, the barn exhaled. Mason looked less relieved than angry. Hannah noticed. So did Santino. A loud crash sounded outside, then shouting. The barn lights flickered. Santino's hand moved beneath his jacket, but no weapon appeared. One of his men entered. "South gate breach. 3 men down. Power is cut from the stable wing." Hannah looked toward the far stall where St. Meridian stood. The horse startled at the noise. Santino's eyes moved to her. "Stay behind me." "No." His gaze hardened. "This is not a suggestion. I have a patient who cannot be moved." "You will have no patient if the men coming in are here to finish what the drug started. And you think I should hide while they do that?" Santino stepped closer. "I think you should remain alive long enough to be stubborn tomorrow." The insult should not have felt intimate. It did. Another crash. The younger vet ran toward the tack room. Hannah grabbed her field kit. Mason Harrow backed toward the side door. Santino noticed. "Lock that door," he said. Mason froze. "You cannot detain me. You are free to remain alive in this barn like everyone else." A gunshot cracked outside. Hannah flinched. Santino moved instantly, pulling her behind a wooden support beam before she could tell him not to touch her. The motion was protective, efficient, and far too natural. His body shielded hers. His hand pressed against the beam beside her head. For one breath, their faces were inches apart. Rain beat the roof. Shouting echoed from the stable yard. Hannah could smell cedar, leather, and the faint, expensive cologne beneath the rain on his shirt. "Are you hurt?" he asked. No. His eyes dropped to where his hand had caught her waist. He released her slowly, as if restraint had to be chosen. "Do not grab me again," she said. "Then do not stand where bullets arrive. That is not an apology. No." He looked toward the barn entrance. "It is a warning, with room for improvement. Despite everything, despite fear and anger, and the sick horse trembling 10 feet away, Hannah almost laughed. Then the barn doors exploded inward. The attack was not chaotic. That made it worse. 4 men entered through the smoke wearing maintenance uniforms and black rain caps. They did not fire wildly. They moved with purpose. 2 toward the evidence cooler, 1 toward the office, 1 toward St. Meridian's stall. They were not here to kill everyone. They were here to erase the drug proof and the horse. Santino's men returned fire from outside, but the barn was crowded with animals, workers, and narrow wooden partitions. "Low!" Santino ordered. Hannah ducked behind a feed bin and crawled toward St. Meridian's stall. The attacker at the stall raised a syringe. Hannah threw the metal end of a lead rope. It struck his hand. The syringe flew into the straw. He turned toward her. Santino crossed the aisle before the man could move. The violence was brief and brutal. Santino drove him into the stall door, twisted his arm, and struck him once. The man collapsed without a sound. Hannah grabbed the syringe with a towel and dropped it into an evidence bag. "Dr. Cole," Santino said. She looked up. Another attacker had Mason Harrow by the collar. Mason screamed. I paid what they asked." The attacker shoved him toward the office. Santino's expression changed. Not surprise. Confirmation. The office door slammed shut. The lights went out completely. Emergency lamps glowed red. Horses screamed down the aisle. Hannah moved stall to stall, securing latches, speaking calmly. She had learned long ago that panic traveled through barns faster than fire. Santino stayed close, too close. Every time she turned, he was between her and the danger. "I need the backup generator," she said. "Where?" "Far end. Mechanical room. Stay here." "No." His eyes narrowed. "Hannah." It was the first time he said her name without the professional title. It landed heavier than it should have. "St. Meridian needs ventilation," she said. "If the emergency fans fail, this barn overheats, and every stressed horse in here gets worse." Santino looked toward the aisle, then back at her. "Behind me. Beside you." "No." She stepped into his space. "I do not take orders from men who confuse protection with control." Something flashed in his eyes. A memory. Pain. Recognition. "Fine," he said. "Beside me. But if someone comes through that door, I move first. I can live with that." His gaze traveled over her face. "Do not make promises casually." They moved through the red-lit barn. At the mechanical room, Hannah found the generator panel open and wires cut. Someone had sliced the fuel line and jammed the transfer switch. She pulled tools from the wall kit. Santino watched the hallway. "You know electrical systems? I grew up in barns." "That is not an answer. It is the best apprenticeship in the world." He glanced back. "Hannah Cole, veterinarian, electrician, public enemy of race fixers. My resume is expanding." The corner of his mouth almost moved. Then he went still. A sound came from the storage loft above them. Santino pushed Hannah behind the generator housing as a man dropped from the rafters with a knife. The fight was close and ugly. No gunfire, no dramatic speech, just bodies hitting metal, breath knocked hard from lungs, Santino's forearm blocking the blade inches from his throat. Hannah saw blood appear along his sleeve. A small cut. He did not react. She grabbed a fire extinguisher and struck the attacker across the shoulder. The man stumbled. Santino finished the fight with one precise blow. Then he looked at her. "You hit him. You were busy. I noticed. You are bleeding. I have had worse. Congratulations." "Hold still," The generator clicked back on as Hannah secured the line. Warm barn lights returned in sections. Hannah reached for Santino's arm. He tried to pull away. She held tighter. "You can intimidate everyone else after I bandage it." For a moment, the entire world narrowed to his eyes on hers. He allowed her to roll up his sleeve. Black and gray tattoos covered his forearm. Roman numerals, thorned roses, and a horse's head with a broken bridle. A thin line of blood cut across one design. Hannah cleaned it with antiseptic. His hand flexed once. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "No." Liar. He looked at her mouth. The air changed. Hannah felt it immediately, and hated that she felt it at all. This was Santino Bellaforte. Her father's name had been found in a folder connected to Bellaforte stables after his death. Her mother had cried every time the family appeared on television. Hannah had chosen veterinary medicine because her father taught her that animals needed advocates in rooms full of men betting on them. Now Santino stood close enough for her to feel his heat, and he looked at her as if the world had narrowed around one impossible problem he could not decide whether to solve or surrender to. She finished wrapping his arm. There. He did not move away. "Hannah!" A shout interrupted from the main aisle. "Mr. Bellaforte!" The moment broke. Santino stepped back. Hannah followed him into the barn. His lieutenant, Marcello, stood near the office door. "We found Harrow." The office was empty. A wall panel behind the trophy cabinet hung open, revealing stairs descending beneath the grandstand. Mason Harrow had disappeared into the old racing tunnels, and he had taken the original blood sample with him. The tunnel beneath Churchill Downs had been built in pieces over nearly a century. Some sections were legitimate: utility corridors, storage access, old drainage paths. Others existed only in rumors told by grooms, gamblers, and retired trainers who claimed certain owners could move money, horses, or people beneath the track without ever passing a public gate. Hannah had heard the stories. She had never believed all of them, until Santino opened a hidden door beneath Barn 12 and led her into a concrete passage lined with old betting windows, disconnected cameras, and dust-covered racing posters from decades past. Rainwater ran along the floor. The sound of the crowd above them came through the concrete like distant thunder. "They call it the rail," Santino said. Hannah walked beside him, carrying her medical kit and a second set of blood samples hidden inside a wrapped bandage roll. She had drawn them before the attack. No one except the younger vet knew. No one except Santino had noticed. "You knew this existed," she said. "My family built parts of it." "Of course they did." He accepted the judgment without defense. The tunnel lamps flickered ahead. Marcello and 2 guards followed at a distance, far enough to give them privacy, but close enough to remind Hannah she had entered the underworld beneath America's most famous horse race, with the most dangerous man in Kentucky. She kept walking. "Why did Mason mention my father?" Santino's shoulders tightened. "I wondered when you would ask." "You knew him?" "Yes." Hannah stopped. The tunnel seemed to breathe around them. Dr. Daniel Cole, state veterinarian, whistleblower, dead 12 years after a suspicious truck accident outside Keeneland. Santino turned. His expression had gone unreadable. Hannah felt her pulse climb. "Tell me why you know my father's case well enough to recite it." "Because I was there." The words struck her like a physical blow. She did not move. "My father's accident?" "Yes." For a moment, she heard nothing but rainwater dripping through the concrete. "What did you do?" Santino's jaw tightened. "I followed him." "Why?" "My Uncle Carlo ordered me to retrieve a cooler from his truck." Hannah's stomach turned. "The blood samples?" "Yes." "You stole them." "I blocked the service road so his truck would stop." Her voice thinned. "And?" The car behind him did not slow. Hannah stepped back. Santino did not move toward her. Good. If he had touched her, she might have broken. "You caused the crash. I created the conditions." That is a very careful way to say yes. His eyes darkened. "Yes." Hannah's breath shook. "Did you know they would hit him?" "No." "Did you help him?" Santino looked away. That was answer enough. Hannah laughed once, sharp and broken. "You left him there." "I called in the accident anonymously." "After taking the evidence?" "Yes." She slapped him. The sound cracked through the tunnel. Marcello started forward. Santino lifted one hand, stopping him. Hannah's palm stung. Santino's face remained turned from the impact. He did not look angry. That made it worse. "My father died because your family wanted to run a horse," she said. "No." He looked back at her. "He died because my family wanted to control every race after that." Hannah shook her head. "I do not care about the distinction." "You should." "Why?" "Because the same drug used today was in the samples he carried." Hannah went still. Santino continued. "Your father discovered a compound called cerulean. It masks fatigue, amplifies cardiac output, and destabilizes the rhythm under extreme exertion. It can make a horse look unstoppable until the final turn. Then, it can stop the heart." "Who made it?" "My uncle's veterinarian." "Who ordered it?" "Carlo Bellaforte." The name landed with cold weight. Carlo was Santino's uncle, the elder face of Bellaforte Racing, a man who appeared on charity boards beside senators and derby legends. He gave interviews about tradition, family, and the soul of American racing. "What is he doing today?" Hannah asked. Santino's mouth hardened. "Running the rail." They continued walking because rage without motion would have consumed her. Santino told her what he had spent years assembling. The rail was an underground betting syndicate built beneath legal racing markets. It manipulated live odds through horse doping, veterinary intimidation, jockey debts, and insider withdrawals. Sometimes the goal was to make a favorite win spectacularly. Sometimes it was to make a favorite collapse at a precise point and trigger enormous payouts across offshore books. St. Meridian was not meant to win. He was meant to fail publicly, on the final stretch. In front of the world, Hannah stopped beneath an old racing mural. "Why stop it today?" Santino looked at her. "I have been cutting Carlo's network quietly for 3 years. That is not an answer. Today was supposed to expose him. You knew St. Meridian would be targeted. I knew Carlo had built a bet around him. I did not know they would use cerulean. You let the horse enter the paddock. I had men watching Harrow's team, and they missed the injection. Yes. You let me walk into it. I did not know you were assigned until this morning." Her eyes narrowed. "What?" "The Derby veterinary roster was changed at 6:12 a.m. By whom?" "Someone inside the state board." Hannah felt a new chill. "My supervisor said Dr. Patel had food poisoning. Dr. Patel is in a hotel room under guard, not by my men. So they put me there." "Yes. Why?" Santino's face turned colder. "Because Carlo knew I would stop the race for Daniel Cole's daughter." The tunnel seemed to tilt. "You used to know me. I knew of you. That is not the same thing." "No. Did you watch me?" He held her gaze, from a distance. The answer should have repulsed her. It did. It also made too many strange pieces shift into place. The anonymous scholarship that had appeared after her father's death. The internship in Lexington no one could explain. The time a private practice withdrew its threat to sue after Hannah refused to clear a horse for competition. "You interfered with my life. I kept certain doors from closing. Without asking. Yes. Because of guilt. At first." The words hung between them. Hannah's anger sharpened. "Do not turn my father's death into a romance." Santino's face became hard. "I would not insult him that way." Voices sounded ahead. They moved to the tunnel wall. Through a cracked service window, Hannah saw an underground control room beneath the grandstand. Screens showed race feeds, betting odds, stable cameras, and offshore transfers. Mason Harrow stood near the center with the blood cooler. Beside him was Carlo Bellaforte. He was in his 60s, silver-haired, immaculate in a dark suit with a red derby rose pinned to his lapel. He looked nothing like a monster. That made him more believable as one. Carlo was speaking into a phone. "The race restarts in 20 minutes. Use the replacement dose. The Cole woman will be blamed for panic, and Santino will be handled as a family matter." Hannah's blood went cold. Replacement dose. St. Meridian was still in barn 12. Santino heard it too. His expression changed. Not into anger, into decision. "We go back," Hannah said. Santino nodded. Then Carlo's voice came through the speaker system in the tunnel. No, you do not. The doors behind them sealed. The lamps went red. A gas hiss began from vents along the ceiling. Marcello shouted from the far end. Santino grabbed Hannah's hand and ran. The gas smelled faintly sweet. Hannah pulled the bandana from around her neck and covered her mouth. Santino kicked open a side maintenance door and shoved her through, before entering behind her. The room was narrow, filled with old equipment lockers and rusted water pipes. He sealed the door with a metal cabinet. Hannah coughed. Is it toxic? Disorienting. Used to clear tunnels without leaving obvious injuries. Your family has charming hobbies. Yes. She bent over, fighting dizziness. Santino steadied her elbow. This time she did not pull away immediately. Only after she caught her balance, he let go. There is a drainage route to the infield, he said. Then we take it. No. Carlo will expect that. Saint Meridian. We'll die if we rush into a second trap. He will die if we stand here. Santino turned toward her. His control was fraying. Hannah, I cannot keep you alive if you treat every threat like a test of character. And I cannot be myself if I abandon an animal because you are afraid. His eyes flashed. I am not afraid. Yes, you are. The silence between them was immediate and intimate. Hannah saw it then. The fear was not of Carlo, not of armed men, not of losing power. It was of seeing another Cole walk toward a danger he had helped create. Santino stepped closer. My fear is not the point. It becomes the point when you turn it into an order. He closed his eyes for 1 second. When he opened them, his voice was quieter. Tell me what you need. The question changed the room. Hannah swallowed. A way back to Barn 12 without using the main tunnel. Clean evidence chain, outside transmission, and Saint Meridian alive. Santino looked at the ceiling. There is an old feed conveyor to the west stables. You have a map? My family buried sins in predictable places. He pulled a small phone from his inside pocket. No signal. He removed the back, extracted a thin drive, and handed it to her. What is this? Everything I have on the rail. Hannah stared. Why give it to me? Because if I do not leave this tunnel, you need something more useful than my apology. She did not take it at first. You expect forgiveness because you collected files? No. Then what do you expect? His gaze held hers. To be hated accurately. Hannah took the drive. Hannah took the drive. Their fingers touched. Neither moved. Then pounding came from the door. Santino looked toward the sound. Conveyor. Now. They climbed through a rusted service hatch into darkness. The old conveyor tunnel was barely tall enough to crouch inside. Dust, grain, and cobwebs clung to the walls. Hannah crawled ahead, the evidence drive tucked inside her bra beneath her shirt, because no one would think to look there before trying to take her bag. Behind her, Santino moved with surprising silence for a man his size. Halfway through the tunnel, the structure shook. A section collapsed behind them. Santino shoved forward, covering Hannah with his body as debris fell. The space filled with dust. Hannah coughed. Santino, I am here. His voice was close. Too close. The collapse had forced them into a narrow pocket, his chest nearly against her back. One arm braced above her to hold a fallen beam. Can you move? She asked. No. Are you hurt? No. Another lie? Possibly. She twisted carefully. His face was inches from hers in the dark. A thin cut crossed his cheekbone. Only a small line of blood. She reached up before thinking, and wiped it with her thumb. His breath stopped. The contact was nothing. It felt like a door opening. Hannah withdrew her hand. We need to get out. Yes, but he did not move immediately. His eyes searched hers. I did not know your father was still alive when I took the samples, he said quietly. The words hit differently in the cramped darkness. He was? For 12 minutes after the crash. Hannah's throat closed. The report said impact killed him instantly. I paid to see the sealed emergency record. She could not breathe. He asked for me? No. A terrible relief. A terrible disappointment. He asked that you never stop telling powerful men no. Hannah closed her eyes. Tears burned, But she refused to let them fall here, trapped beneath a racetrack with the man who had helped steal her father's last chance at justice. Santino's voice lowered. I have heard those words every day for 12 years. Good. Yes. The beam shifted. Santino grunted softly. Hannah looked up. You are hurt. Bruised ribs. Can you hold it? Yes. How long? As long as you need. The answer was too much. She turned away. Do not say things like that. Why? Because I might believe you for 1 second, and I do not have room for that. Santino was silent. Then, with careful force, he shifted the beam enough for Hannah to crawl beneath it. She turned back and helped him through. They emerged near the west stables as the rain intensified outside. Barn 12 was visible across the service lane. So were the men entering it through the rear door. St. Meridian stood trapped in his stall with 3 strangers. One held a syringe. Hannah did not think. She ran. Santino cursed behind her. Hannah! She crossed the rain-slick lane and slammed through the rear door with a shoulder that would ache tomorrow if she survived tonight. The man with the syringe turned. Hannah threw her medical kit at his hand. The syringe struck the stall bars and shattered. St. Meridian reared. One of the attackers tried to grab his lead. Santino arrived like a shadow made of violence. He took the first man down and drove the second into the stall partition. The third ran toward the door and found Marcello, waiting with 2 track police officers. Hannah entered the stall. St. Meridian trembled, whites of his eyes showing. Easy, she whispered. Easy, boy. I know. The horse pressed his head briefly into her shoulder. She closed her eyes for half a second. Santino stood outside the stall, breathing hard. Rain dripped from his hair onto his shirt. His eyes were fixed on her and the horse, as if the entire world had narrowed to the space they occupied. Hannah drew another sample. This time, she handed it directly to a track police officer. Body camera on? Yes, ma'am. State your name and badge. He did. She sealed the tube in front of him. Evidence sample from St. Meridian, collected after a suspected attempted second injection during racetrack lockdown. The officer nodded. Mason Harrow's voice came from behind them. You stupid woman. Hannah turned. Mason stood at the barn entrance with a phone in one hand. He looked soaked, desperate, and furious. You think this makes you important? Santino stepped forward. Mason flinched but kept talking. Do you know what happens when billions in live markets collapse? Do you know how many people lose money? How many people lose patience? Hannah looked at him. You drugged your horse to manipulate a bet. I invested in a system. You nearly killed him. He is an animal. The barn went still. Even Santino's face changed. Hannah walked toward Mason. He trusts people to put hands on him, to feed him, to lead him, to tell him when to run. That makes him more honorable than every man who sold his body tonight. Mason's expression twisted. Your father said almost the same thing. Santino moved. Hannah lifted one hand without looking at him. He stopped. The obedience startled everyone, including Mason. Hannah stepped closer. What did my father say? Mason smiled. That horses do not owe men their deaths. Hannah's throat tightened. Mason continued. Then he died in the rain with blood samples he thought would save the sport. Santino's voice went dangerously soft. Do not speak of him again. Mason looked at him. Why? Because she does not know you were on the road? The barn shifted. All eyes turned to Hannah. She already knew, but the public cruelty of it still cut. Mason saw her face. Oh, he told you. His smile widened. Did he tell you Carlo kept the dash recording? Santino went still. Hannah turned to him. What recording? Mason laughed. You do not even know. Santino seized Mason by the collar. Hannah did not stop him this time. Mason choked out. Ask your uncle what your father said before he ordered the second car. Santino's face drained of color. His father, not Carlo alone. The Bellaforte patriarch, dead for years and remembered publicly as a racing legend, had been involved in Daniel Cole's death. A new fracture opened in Santino's silence. Marcello dragged Mason away. Hannah stared at Santino. You did not know. No. For the first time since she met him, Santino Bellaforte looked young. Not innocent, never innocent, but less armored. The barn loudspeakers crackled. Carlo Bellaforte's voice filled the stable. The Derby Committee has accepted a revised veterinary clearance. St. Meridian runs in 15 minutes. Hannah's blood went cold. That is impossible. Santino looked toward the grandstand. No, he said. That is the Empire. Underscore. They reached the main track through a service tunnel beneath the paddock. Rain turned the dirt surface dark and shining beneath stadium lights. The crowd had been told the race would restart after a veterinary miscommunication. The grandstands buzzed with confusion, anger, and excitement. The Derby broadcast had not stopped. It had become the biggest live sporting scandal in years. St. Meridian was being led toward the starting gate again by Harrow's remaining staff. A different veterinarian stood near the steward's platform, holding paperwork. Hannah recognized him, Dr. Philip Vane. He had been one of her father's colleagues. He had also signed off on 3 questionable race day clearances in the last decade. Hannah walked onto the track. Security moved toward her. Then Santino stepped beside her. The image hit the stadium screens. Hannah Cole in her rain-soaked veterinary coat, hair loose, mud on her boots, standing beside Santino Bellaforte, black shirt clinging to his broad frame, one sleeve torn, a blood-dark line on his cheek, eyes cold enough to quiet 50,000 people. Carlo Bellaforte stood in the owner's box above the finish line. He lifted a microphone. "Nephew, leave the track." Santino looked up. "No." The stadium roared. Carlo smiled as if disappointed. "You have embarrassed the family enough." Santino's voice came through every broadcast microphone, because Marcello had patched his signal into the Derby feed. "The family embarrassed itself before I was old enough to know what shame was." Carlo's smile faded. Hannah looked at him. "What are you doing?" "What I should have done 12 years ago." Santino raised his phone. Behind him, the giant screen changed. No longer the track, no longer the horses. Files appeared. Bank transfers. Veterinary reports. Offshore betting ledgers. Surveillance images from underground tunnels. Then a video began. Dashcam footage. Rainy road. Daniel Cole's truck stopping at an angle beneath headlights. A younger Santino stepping from a black car. Hannah's knees nearly weakened. Santino did not look away from the screen. The footage showed him opening the truck, removing the cooler, shouting into his phone. His face was panicked, younger, not yet the man beside her. Then another car approached from behind, too fast. Santino turned. The impact happened off-frame, but the sound carried through the stadium speakers. Hannah closed her eyes. Santino's voice broke through the silence. "I blocked Daniel Cole's road. I took the evidence he was carrying. I obeyed orders from the Bellaforte family." The stadium was silent now. Even the horses seemed to feel it. "I have spent 12 years calling guilt a strategy. I told myself that gathering evidence would make my silence useful." He looked toward Hannah. She did not know whether to hate him more for confessing or less for doing it while the world watched. Dr. Cole's daughter found the same drug in St. Meridian today. She was mocked, removed, and nearly killed because the system that murdered her father is still alive. Carlo shouted something from the box, but the microphone no longer carried him. Santino continued. "The Bellaforte racing empire is dissolved effective immediately." The giant screen displayed legal documents. The crowd erupted again. Hannah stared. "What?" Santino's face remained calm, but his hand shook slightly around the phone. "All Bellaforte racing assets, breeding shares, private barns, training properties, veterinary contracts, and track security holdings transfer into an independent equine integrity trust supervised by federal investigators, state racing authorities, and Dr. Daniel Cole's foundation." Carlo's face contorted. "You cannot do that." Santino looked up at him. "I already signed. You are destroying billions. Yes, the family will tear you apart." Santino's gaze returned to Hannah. "Let them try." The starting gate crew stepped away from the horses. Hannah crossed to St. Meridian. This time no one stopped her. She removed the racing bridle. The colt lowered his head. The crowd began to chant, not the horse's name now, but something stranger. "Let him rest." The words spread slowly, then louder. "Let him rest. Let him rest." Hannah's throat tightened. Carlo Bellaforte left the owner's box. Santino saw him go. "He is heading for the tunnel server room," he said. "What is there?" "The Rails live market core. If he destroys it, half the evidence disappears, and the betting ring survives offshore. Then we stop him." "No." Hannah looked at him. "Do not start." Santino stepped close. "The last time a Cole chased evidence through Bellaforte property, he died. The last time, you stood in the road." The words hit him. He absorbed them, then nodded once. "Beside me." "Beside me," she corrected. For the first time, he did not argue. Underscore. The server room was beneath the old grandstand, behind a locked door marked electrical authorized personnel only. Carlo's men were already there. So were armed private guards, 2 corrupt racing officials, and Dr. Vane. The illegal market core occupied a room lined with black servers and cooling systems. Screens displayed live odds collapsing across offshore platforms. Billions of dollars were bleeding out as the derby remained stopped and Bellaforte assets froze. Carlo stood at the center holding a steel case. He looked at Hannah as if she were dirt dragged onto an expensive floor. "Your father was more graceful when he lost." Hannah stepped forward. "My father did not lose." Carlo smiled. "He died, and still taught me enough to stop you." Carlo looked at Santino. "You brought her here. She brought herself. You sound trained." Santino said nothing. Carlo's gaze hardened. "You think giving away barns makes you clean. You were there. You took the cooler. You let Daniel Cole bleed on the roadside while you saved the family." Hannah watched Santino's face. He did not flinch. "Yes," he said. Carlo seemed disappointed. Truth gave him less to use. "Then take responsibility now," Carlo said. "Walk away, and I let the veterinarian live." Santino's body went still. Hannah understood instantly. Carlo had not used her name. Not Dr. Cole. Not Hannah. The veterinarian. An object in a deal. Santino's eyes darkened with a violence that filled the room. Hannah touched his arm. The contact stopped him. Carlo noticed. "Touching," he said. "Does she know how many horses died before you developed a conscience?" "Yes," Hannah said. Everyone looked at her. "He told me enough." Carlo laughed. "And you stand beside him?" "I stand beside the evidence." The words struck Santino harder than if she had defended him personally. She saw it. Good. He needed truth more than comfort. Dr. Vane moved toward a side console. Hannah saw the syringe in his hand, not for a horse, for the backup evidence sample. She lunged. Vane swung at her, but Hannah ducked and drove her shoulder into his ribs. The syringe fell. She crushed it under her boot. Chaos broke. Santino moved like controlled force, disarming one guard, slamming another into a server rack, keeping his body between Hannah and every weapon without pushing her out of the fight. Marcello and state police breached from the service entrance. Carlo ran toward the manual override. If he triggered the thermal purge, the servers would melt. Hannah grabbed the steel case from the floor and threw it across the room. Carlo turned instinctively. Santino reached him. Uncle and nephew collided against the main console. Carlo pulled a small blade. Santino caught his wrist. For a moment, they locked together. 2 generations of the same family's violence reflected in each other's eyes. Carlo hissed. "You think she will love you after watching what you are?" Santino looked at Hannah. Rainwater dripped from her hair. Mud streaked her coat. Her face was pale but unbroken. "No," he said. "I think she will decide for herself." He released Carlo's wrist and stepped back. Carlo lunged. State police tackled him before Santino could strike. Hannah realized what he had done. He had given up the kill, not because he was gentle, because the truth needed an arrest, because Daniel Cole had died for evidence, not revenge. The server screens shifted. Marcello shouted, "Upload complete." The Rails records transmitted to federal racing investigators, financial crimes units, and every regulatory authority Santino had prepared. Carlo Bellaforte's empire ended in a basement beneath the Kentucky Derby, not with a gunshot. With data, body cameras, blood samples, and a veterinarian who refused to leave the track. Underscore. The Derby did not run that day. For the first time in modern memory, the race was canceled after the favorite was scratched for medical emergency, and a criminal investigation consumed the grounds. By dawn, the story had taken over every news channel in America. The viral image was not Santino's confession, though that came close. It was Hannah Cole, removing St. Meridian's bridle in the rain, while the grandstand chanted for the horse to rest. The blood test confirmed cerulean in St. Meridian's system. Dr. Philip Vane was arrested. Mason Harrow attempted to leave the state in a private jet and was intercepted in Nashville. Carlo Bellaforte faced charges connected to illegal betting, drug conspiracy, witness intimidation, financial crimes, and the death of Daniel Cole. Santino Bellaforte was not arrested that morning. Not because he was innocent, because the evidence he provided was too large, the cooperation agreement too public, and the legal consequences too complicated to unfold in a single sunrise. Hannah did not speak to him for 6 days. She spent those days at the equine hospital with St. Meridian. The horse improved steadily. His rhythm stabilized. His appetite returned. He began nudging Hannah's pockets for peppermints, with the confidence of an animal who had no idea he had become the symbol of a national scandal. On the 7th night, Hannah found Santino outside the hospital barn. It was raining again. Of course it was. He stood beneath the overhang in a dark coat, no guards visible, holding a folder in one hand. "You are persistent," she said. "I have been here 6 nights." "I know." His gaze sharpened. "You knew? The night techs are terrible at pretending not to stare out the window." "I did not want to enter without permission." That sentence did more damage to her anger than she wanted. Hannah crossed her arms. "What is in the folder?" "Your father's complete file. Everything I had. Everything Carlo hid. Everything my father recorded." She took it. Her fingers brushed his. The old electricity was still there. Dangerous. Unwelcome. Not entirely unwanted. "I read the public confession," she said. He looked down. "I should have told you privately before the track." "Yes. I was afraid you would walk away before I could stop the race." "You still think fear explains control?" "No," he met her eyes. "I think fear explains the lie. It does not excuse it." Hannah looked toward St. Meridian's stall. The horse slept peacefully under low light. "You destroyed your family's empire." "Yes." "For me?" Santino was silent for a moment. Then he shook his head. "For what your father died trying to prove. For the horses. For the people Carlo bought. For the part of me that needed to stop being useful to dead men." Her throat tightened. "And me." His voice lowered. "For you, I stopped wanting to survive as the man who could own the outcome." Hannah did not know what to do with that. It was not clean enough to forgive. It was too honest to dismiss. She looked at the folder. "I do not forgive you. I know. I may never. I know. I am still angry. You should be. You are very annoying when you agree with me." A faint, almost impossible softness touched his mouth, then vanished. Hannah stepped closer. "If you come near my barn again, you ask first." "Yes." "No guards inside." "Yes." "No donations to my clinic without board approval and public records." His eyebrow shifted. That was specific. "I know men like you." "No," he said quietly. "You know men I am trying not to remain." The air changed again. Hannah hated how easily it did. Santino lifted his hand toward her face, stopped, waited. The restraint trembled through him. She could see what it cost. Hannah should have stepped back. Instead, she reached up and touched the scar near his mouth. "Ask," she said. His eyes darkened. "May I kiss you?" The question was calm. The need beneath it was not. Hannah answered by closing the last inch herself. The kiss was not gentle at first. It was restrained, which was different. Santino held himself back like a man gripping the edge of a cliff, allowing only as much closeness as she chose to take. Hannah's hand tightened in his coat. He made a low sound against her mouth and stopped immediately. She almost smiled. Still asking without words? "I am learning. Keep learning." She kissed him again. Inside the barn, St. Meridian huffed softly in his sleep. For once, no one demanded he run. 6 months later, the Kentucky Derby returned under a different kind of attention. New veterinary protocols, independent drug testing, public oversight, anonymous reporting channels, federal monitors in the barns. The Bellaforte name had been removed from the grandstand sponsorships, training barns, security badges, and private auction rooms. The new Equine Integrity Trust was named for Daniel Cole. Hannah did not want to attend the opening ceremony. She went anyway. Not for cameras. For her father. A bronze plaque had been installed beside the paddock walkway. Dr. Daniel Cole. He believed no race was worth a life. St. Meridian stood nearby in a recovery paddock, retired from racing and transferred into the trust care. His owner had lost him through criminal forfeiture. He now belonged to no betting syndicate, no billionaire ego, and no derby fantasy. Hannah scratched the white star on his forehead. "You caused a lot of trouble," she whispered. The horse nudged her shoulder. Santino stood several feet away, giving her space. He wore a dark suit, no rose on his lapel, no family pin. The tattoos at his wrists showed when the wind moved his cuffs. He still looked dangerous. He always would. But the space around him had changed. People no longer moved away because he owned the room. Some moved away because they remembered what he had done to the last empire that tried to silence Hannah Cole. She turned toward him. "You can come closer." He did. Not quickly. When he reached her side, he looked at the plaque. "I spoke with the Attorney General," he said. "My cooperation agreement is finalized. And house confinement for 18 months. Financial penalties. Permanent ban from racing ownership. Continued testimony." Hannah absorbed that. "You will hate house confinement." "Yes." "Good." He nodded. "Fair." She looked at St. Meridian. "What will you do after?" "Rebuild what is legal. Stay away from what is not." That sounds like a press statement. It was. Santino. He looked at her. "What will you do?" For the first time, he seemed uncertain. "Ask before entering," he said. "Tell the truth before it becomes a weapon. Stop calling fear strategy. Stand where I am invited." Hannah looked away, because the answer hurt. Not because it was wrong. Because it was exactly what she had needed him to understand. The loudspeakers announced the ceremonial first walk of the restored Derby grounds. No race. Not that day. Just horses walking calmly before the crowd, while veterinarians, grooms, and retired jockeys led them. St. Meridian was first. The handler offered Hannah the lead rope. She took it. Then she looked at Santino. He stood with his hands at his sides, watching the horse, the plaque, and her. "Walk with us," she said. Something moved in his face. Not triumph, not possession. Gratitude restrained by disbelief. He joined her on St. Meridian's other side. Together, they walked onto the track where he had once stopped the Derby and where she had once been dragged off for telling the truth. The grandstand rose to its feet. Hannah kept her eyes forward. Santino walked beside her, not ahead. At the far turn, sunlight broke through the clouds and struck the wet track in gold. St. Meridian lowered his head, calm and alive. Hannah felt Santino's hand near hers, not touching, waiting. She slipped her fingers into his. The crowd became distant. The track, the cameras, the scandal, the empire, and the past all fell behind the rhythm of a living horse walking safely through the place that had almost killed him. Santino looked at their joined hands, then at Hannah. "I stopped the race for you," he said quietly. "No," she said. "You stopped it because I was right." He considered that, then nodded. "And I stayed," she said, "because you finally learned the difference." The mafia boss who had once believed power meant making the world stop at his command walked beside her in silence. This time, the horses moved because Hannah allowed it. This time, no one dragged her away. And when the track opened before them, Santino Bellaforte did not take the lead. He followed the veterinarian who had saved the horse, exposed the empire, and taught him that love was not stopping the race forever. It was making sure the one person brave enough to tell the truth was never forced off the track again.